So, without further ado, I think I'd like to bring up our first speaker. And we'll work on getting the PowerPoint together. Our first speaker is actually Ben Alamar, who's a professor of sports management and statistics at Menlo College, and he's the founding editor of JQS, the Journal for Quantitative Analysis in Sports. He's consulted with sports teams in the NBA and the NFL on strategy and personnel evaluation.
So as you can see, and as my talk will probably prove shortly, when given the same choice, Scott, I chose good looks. So, but I'm here to talk about risk in NFL play calling. And so this basically, because of the way the data we have, this boils down into looking at runs and passes. And this is, and been talked about before. I talked about it in 2006. Romer talks about not runs and passes, but choices on whether to go for on fourth down. Just recently on my way here, I learned that Wayne Winston, who will be presenting later, talks about it in his forthcoming book. And Dwayne Rockerby also has discussed the idea of whether we should run or pass more, and whether coaches are being rational in the NFL. Most of the analysis that's out there suggests that teams don't pass enough. There seems to be an increased payoff, and there have been various metrics used for this to determine this, but passing seems to get you more overall than running does. But there hasn't been a real good measure of the risk involved, so we don't know if there's a risk-reward trade-off which would actually make it rational for coaches to be striving for the run-pass balance that they all claim to be striving for. One of the few measures of risk that's out there is Rockerby defined risk as the standard deviation of yards, and used yards as the outcome. This doesn't really work for a couple of reasons. One, there's no context for yards. Obviously, 5 yards gained is, the value of that is different from play to play, depending on what down it is, how many yards to go. And you also have this, the distribution of yards on plays is not a normal distribution. It's really truncated below 0 to a large extent. And so higher standard deviations, higher variance is good. We want more what he defines as risk, because if you take 2 plays that have the same expected outcome, the one with the higher variance is the one that's going to bigger benefit, and with no real the downside doesn't counterbalance the upside with that measure. So the first thing we need to do is give context to these plays, to yards, because since yards by itself does not have any context, we need to consider the down, the distance, where we are on the field, to determine how good a particular outcome is. And to do this, there are a couple of different ways to do this, but one way, the way I'm using in this paper, is an expected points framework. So how many points can you expect to gain given your down, your distance, and how far you are from the goal? Okay? And from that, we can then determine the value of each play by just looking at the change in expected points from play to play. So this has been done before. Again, this is the expected points framework has a long history in baseball and has been used in football previously. So there's not a whole lot that's new about trying to do expected points. So the function, expected points, is function, and here I just limit it to down, yards to go, and yard line. There have been attempts to incorporate time to go here, and other variables, score differential as well. But trying to keep it simple, I kept it to just the 3 variables. And so then you can determine the net expected points created on any given play by just looking at the difference between the points, expected points, and any points scored on the play. You can expand this even further if you want to look all the way to the end of a half, or all the way to the end of a game, or just to the next drive of how many points get scored. But again, to keep it simple, just looking at the one drive in isolation, And then to create an expected, the net expected value for when we're calculating the value of each play as we go through it. On a turnover, when you have a negative of the expected points the other team is now going to be able to score now that they've got the ball. So that's the nod to the idea that a drive in isolation is not by itself a fair way to look at things, but again, for simplicity, we just kept it to the points scored on that one drive. So the data, I have play-by-play data thanks to Football Outsiders. So from 2005 to 2008, so over 200,000 plays. And we have great, for play type, so we know whether every play was a run or a pass. We know the down, yards to go. For first, the distance from the end zone, which team's on offense, which team's on defense, as well as several other play indicators. And so from that data, we can calculate how many points were scored on a drive. And we can also calculate how many plays were on that drive. Okay? And that we're going to use in our regression, in a weighted least squares regression. So we estimate the expected points equation using weighted least squares, weighted by the number of plays on the drive. So just the one play, 99-yard drive doesn't skew the data. We also included several control variables for each quarter. We had fixed effects, and then for each team each year. We included those to control for our parameters. And of course, given the sample size, statistical significance wasn't a problem, and we had an R-squared of 0.37. And so here we can see our estimates, and just since the goal was used in natural logs, and when we apply that to all of our data, and we look at your expected points on 1st and 10 from, based on the yard line, you can see you get the curve that you would basically expect to get. So, first and goal on the 1 is you better get that touchdown. Now we can take the net expected points using our expected points estimated equation, and I calculated that for every play in the data set. And so just to make sure, have some kind of check on it to see if this was at all connected to perceptions and realities, I calculated the average net expected points for every offense that I had and every defense for their points allowed. So we can look at the top 10, and it seems to check out as somewhat not all that different from what we would expect to get with the 2007 Patriots being the top offense over time. Last year's Steelers, the best defense over that time frame. So we have pretty strong correlations between winning and both this average offense and average defense net expected points. So that seems like it ties into reality to some extent. So now we can go back to our question of running and passing. And now, because of the way a football game proceeds, very often, we're playing against an opponent to a certain point in the game. After a certain point in the game, we stop playing against that opponent, and we're playing against the clock. So if you are up by 15 points in the fourth quarter, you're not really playing against your opponent. You're playing against the clock. You're trying to run it out. So that changes your choices and what's rational. So in doing this analysis, I stepped back and just looked at plays where there's a high probability that we were actually playing against an opponent and trying to score points as opposed to just trying to kill the clock. And so I used plays through the third quarter where the score difference was less than 11 points and looked at the average net expected points created by runs and passes. And we can see that passes create, on average, close to twice as many points than runs. So this is the same kind of result that is seen over and over in other metrics. Passing has a higher payoff than running. But now we have to look at risk and see if there's any kind of risk-reward trade-off. And when I thought about risk, and what I wanted to capture was really the downside risk here. Upside risk is great, but downside risk is what we need to really factor in, because that's what, when people are talking about risk, in passing, they're talking about, well, sacks and interceptions, and that's really bad. So I created the probability that a play will create negative expected points. And so when we looked at this risk factor, we can see that passing is less risky than running. Okay? So running has, for that same set of plays, running has a risk factor of 0.62, and passing has a risk factor of 0.57. So on that large set of plays, we're overall much better, have a higher payoff passing, and we have a lower risk in passing. So this seems like a really good thing to do. Now, that risk profile changes. Okay, so it's not fair to just say, well, passing is always less risky. Passing is always the thing to do, and and we should go some extreme, constantly run and shoot kind of offense. So we want to look at specific situations and see how the risk profile changes. And so for example, on 1st and 10, running has a risk factor of 0.66, and passing has a risk factor of 0.53. So on 1st and 10, we need to be passing more than we are right now. Okay? We should be passing a lot more. You go to 2nd and 3, which you would get to if you were passing on 1st and 10, then the risk factor of running goes way down. Now you just have a risk factor of 0.35 for running. So then running becomes a lot more attractive once you get closer to that first down mark. And we can, looking at all second down plays based on yards to go using a logistic regression, you can see where the transition occurs. Starting out, 2nd and 15, running, incredibly risky. Passing, risky, but not nearly as risky as running. And it gets closer down to about the 4 or 5 yard range is when they're about the same, and then running becomes less risky, less than 4 yards. So that's how risk behaves on second down. And you can do this for 3rd down and 1st down. 1st down is hard because there are so few plays that are not 1st and 10, or a lot of 1st and 5s, but very little else. So you have sample size issues. So in conclusion, this further supports the existence of the passing premium, and actually makes it even more significant, because not only is passing now, particularly on 1st and 10, when we're looking at 1st down plays, passing is higher expected value, not as risky as running, okay, when we take in the full context of the plays and the context of the outcomes. So if teams pass more, their probability of winning would likely increase. And the coach's insistence on balancing the run and the pass seems to embrace more risk overall, except for maybe risk and job security, than needed. And so then finally, not on the slide, we can use this expected points framework and this risk mentality. If we had really good data on who's on the field, we can start using this to start actually grading players and how they can affect each outcome and affect the expected points outcome too. So that down the line, that's the future of what we can do with expected points framework. So, any? Yeah.
I'm wondering if the risk would change significantly if you included the risk of getting your quarterback killed.
Yeah. The risk of quarterback injury is interesting, and you're right. It's not incorporated here. It would be interesting to try and model in quarterback hits and whether that just number of hits affects not over a particular season, because that's all we really care about. Performance or games missed and things. It would be an interesting addition. Yeah. Right.
So I wonder how much the coaches deciding to run has something to do with the fact
right.
that they don't want to seem to be passing every time.
Yeah, there's certainly, obviously, there's some game theoretic mixed strategy that's ideal. I think, however, and this goes back to my earlier work on this, what you can see is when teams are expecting you to pass in situations where they're pretty sure you're going to pass, you still do better passing. So I'm not advocating 100% passing. There is a mixed strategy, but I think the mixed strategy, particularly on 1st and 10, is a much higher passing rate than exists currently.
And so I'm wondering if there are some more like team-specific sorts of issues that are going on here. I was remembering watching the Indianapolis Dolphins game last week and just watching Miami just like blow holes using the Wildcat strategy, just going through Indianapolis defense. And they didn't even need to, Pennington didn't even need to pass.
Mm-hmm.
So depending on what matchups there are.
Yeah, I think there's clearly game to game and team. Some teams are better passing teams and better running teams. But the variation you see, particularly when you start looking at the pass-run breakdown on 1st and 10, or these downs where teams just run a lot more. There's not a whole lot of there's no team that goes out and passes 85% of the time on 1st and 10, which you'd like to see somebody try and do it at least, and see what happens. Yeah.
Did you say your analyses were based when teams were playing the teams and not when they're playing against the clock?
Yes. Yeah. We tried I tried to look at a sample of plays where the goal for the offense would be to score points as opposed to running out the clock.
Right, but then there's the other side of it too, where toward the end of the game, if the team is way behind.
Oh yeah. Then they're just
their passing statistics
yeah.
would be totally skewed.
Right. Exactly.
So then it would appear as though
Yeah.
passing is better, even though it may not be.
Right. So we eliminate any time because those teams again are playing against the clock in a different way. We're trying to look at just normal football situations where one team is trying to score and not do it as quickly as they can.
Then how would you explain what I would claim is a huge success that the 80s and 90s 49ers that scripted, say, 20 plays at the beginning of the game, regardless, of the down and the yardage, and they had unbelievable success with their first and second drives where, it didn't seem like a statistical analysis.
Well, with the 49ers are also one of the highest passing, one of the teams that passed the most. They, for that era, they were one of the first teams to really bump up the passing more than other teams. So I haven't analyzed their scripted plays versus their non-scripted plays and try and break that down. But I think their success was part of that, with the Bill Walsh strategy. But
Isn't there a quarterback effect too? If you've got a good quarterback, you're more apt to pass. If you got a bad quarterback, you're more apt to run.
yeah, I mean.
If you're averaging over quarterbacks, there's some kind of, it seems like there's some kind of quarterback effect issue.
There's definitely to try and tell every team that there's one mixed strategy, it would be absurd. There's not. You're absolutely right. When you've got Peyton Manning, you should be throwing the ball, a ton. When you've got, Jamarcus Russell, being from the Bay Area, that's tough for me. You really don't. But on average, and this is what we've got here is. Teams aren't, it just doesn't seem like, even with an average quarterback, you're not passing enough here.
Hey, Ben, you showed us some charts about versus the yard line. Have you looked at this on how it varies versus time? There's the conventional wisdom, right? The team square down, you do the running in the first half.
I didn't incorporate time into this expressly, so I haven't looked at that. Because specifically since I was looking at one drive in isolation on it was less of an issue for this. But I think time can have an effect, and it would be interesting to see how risk changes with time. Yeah.
Was your measure of risk the probability of a negative points?
Exactly.
I think you got to look at the average downside risk above that, because I think that's where passes kill you.
I thought about that, trying to figure out some sort of weighted average of negative plays, and yeah, well, I mean, we want to just capture the downside risk, and really the negative aspect of passing has been dropping as interception rates have dropped over time. And that's really, to me, limiting the risk. I think the bigger risk is really the wear and tear on your quarterback that is just discussed earlier, as opposed to the turnovers and the sacks are they don't measure up to getting 2 yards on 1st and 10 10 times a game.
And why is it obvious that high variance is
Because because you have no downside. Okay, the downside is much smaller. The level of downside is much smaller than the upside. Okay, it just doesn't go back more than 5 yards.
But if I gain 3 yards every play, I will win every game. If I have no variance, I'll get marched down the field.
Right, but if you take 2 plays that have an expected yards of 3 yards on every play, the higher variance, you're going to get to that goal line quicker.
But I might never get there because I might get the 2 yards every play.
Yeah, I mean, in absolute, I mean, that's correct. It's not the way it works. We don't have that distribution. But because when you compare with the actual distributions, when you compare it, because of this very small left side of negative side of that yards gain distribution, you can't make up for the huge upside that exists when you're looking at just standard deviation of yards.
Maybe I missed it, but what was the calculation for expected points?
It was a weighted least squares regression of points on a drive with our independent variables.
You didn't actually report the regression, right?
I did. Where are they? Here.
Oh, right, okay.
Okay.
Could we see that graph you just passed it, the down? Yeah, where is, I thought there was 0 somewhere. Is that expected points?
This is on 1st and 10, expected points scored.
It's negative. Oh, yeah. It's bad. If you had a choice between having it on your own 3-yard line offense or the other team having it on their 3, you would choose to have them on their 3. But this, I don't see how that comes from this graph. I was thinking of a horizontal line where it'd be a break even, or you wouldn't care whether you had a...
The point where you want them to have the ball at that point.
I don't see where that
Yeah.
comes from this graph.
We don't have a negative side on the expected points here on 1st and 10. How it comes out on this regression, perhaps if we included more, further looking down plays. So because since we're looking at just one drive as opposed to multiple drives, that's where the negative will come in.
One last question. So maybe the terminology might be estimated expected points because it's based on the regression equation, I believe.
Yeah, it's definitely estimated expected.